So I'm going to, I think probably what a historian might call a romp through the sort of history of the arts and crafts movement, starting more or less from here. Really my sort of personalised view of things that I've found interesting and drawn out from, in some ways, a lifetime in crafts, although I'm the director of a visual arts organisation. So, starting off with Ruskin and his piercing gaze, this self-portrait. Ruskin is obviously somebody people will be aware of, very important thinker in terms of the arts and crafts, and particularly Unto This Last, which was published in 1862, I think. It's another portrait of him, this time taken by Lewis Carroll, while at Oxford. And while at Oxford, the project that I think of many things he did, the project that's always appealed to me was the Ruskin's Road project, which was a road that linked North Hinckley and South Hinckley, in which he employed a lot of the undergraduates, 60 in total, in fact, in the end, to manually build a road. And you can see from this quote here, this is from Rawnsley, who was one of the road builders, that Ruskin was very concerned with the retention of certain lichens and liverworts and the like. So he wasn't just building a road, he was building a beautiful road with flowery banks. So, which I noticed on the way down on the train, actually, the roads still have flowery banks, maybe a Ruskin legacy. No, I don't think so. Anyway, so the very important thing about the road was the people involved in it. And in fact, they didn't finish it. They crossed half the marsh that joined the two towns and all went home for summer holidays and never finished it. So it remains, that's rather symbolically, as a dog walking exercise. So it's well used, but only by dog walkers. So I'm told, I haven't actually seen it, but but the important thing is who was on the road building, and Rawnsley, as I've already mentioned, Collingwood, and many other important arts and crafts related movers and shakers of the 19th century. This is Ashby, who wasn't on the road. Went to Oxford about 10 years later. But obviously, Toynbee was on the road building, so there's a connection here. So Ashby, wrote his book Whitechapel to Camelot, was his expedition with 150 workers, craft workers from here, this settlement, to Chipping Campden, which is a very beautifully preserved medieval village, which some of you may know in Gloucestershire. And Gloucestershire was at that time becoming a sort of hub of the arts and crafts movement, so there was lots of other people like Morris and Gimson and so on working there. And Ashby set up a school, and I think this is what interests me about this, is it was a school, it was an education, and craft, although it was very central to it, it was using craft. The purpose of craft was to gain an education. Unfortunately, the school only lasted 2 years. But it did continue, and it does still continue, actually, the remnants of it. It's also the base for Robert Welsh, who was 50s and 60s metalworker, designer. Interestingly, you might notice the photograph was taken by Frank Lloyd Wright, which makes, again, something for my art-orientated, everything's supposed to connect kind of mind, is a rather satisfying connection that Wright went to Chipping Campden and knew Ashby. Ashby visited Wright in America, and Taliesin, Wright's commune in Nevada, came out of the ideas that he developed with Ashby. Slightly incidental, but G.F. Watts in his church and gallery. This was, again, a quite interesting arts and crafts experiment where his wife mainly trained and worked with the local village to make the interiors of the church. So it's got some incredible interiors, and it's just been renovated, and it's in Godalming. So it's a day trip if anybody's got time while they're on the conference. Arthur Simpson, this is slightly close to home for me, as the Lake District, and Simpson was an important arts and crafts furniture maker, worked with Voysey, but worked very closely with Ruskin and Rawnsley in the Lake District. And you can see actually the sort of little Venetian influence even in his workshop. More of him later. That's Frank Lloyd Wright, and that you'll probably recognise as the Guggenheim, but it was actually built to be a cosmic energy receptor, drawing on the influence of Gurdjieff and on Hilaire Ribet, who was the commissioner of it, and another figure in the arts and crafts movement to some extent. And this is Gordon Russell. So these are projects that came out, perhaps are related to the things I was talking about before. And Gordon Russell set up in Broadway and lived in Shipping Camden, and is a bridge really from the arts and crafts to modern furniture and office furniture design, things not dissimilar to the furniture in this building here. So over a long period of time. But for me, again, really interestingly, Broadway is a relatively small town in Gloucestershire or Worcestershire, anyway, somewhere on the border. And at the high point of Gordon Russell, there were 250 cabinet makers working in their works in the factory. Factory is probably a slightly unkind term for it. So it was a marriage of craft skill and machine work. So they did use machines. And Gordon Russell went on very significantly to lead the utility furniture. It wasn't a movement, it was a requirement, a government directive during the war, which was about conserving materials, and very interesting to look at. I'm sure people know about it. And then I couldn't leave Bernard Leach out, so with the St Ives project. And then again, further influence and international influence. This is Tolstoy, and Tolstoy, the Tolstoy Farms. A great believer in Ruskin's ideals for craft and craft as an educator, and Gandhi, who perhaps made the most obvious contribution to the idea of craft as an educator, so that a system of education based on craft. So his three crafts that all education should be based on were agriculture, weaving, and spinning. So I don't expect people to know he spun and wove all his own clothes and lived in an untouchables commune, which would be kind of equivalent to David Cameron living in Norris Green and selling dodgy meat at car boot sales. So it's kind of quite an extraordinary moment, and somebody recently gave me a statistic for India of 150 million craftspeople, which is kind of mind-boggling, and an education system that still draws on some of these ideas of craft as an educator. So I'm just going to talk about a project that started in the 20s at Dartington Hall, started by the Elmhursts, and drawing very much from Ruskin and particularly Gandhi and Tagore. So Tagore was an important figure who visited Dartington and promoted the idea of a full craft education as the basis for education. So you learn everything else through craft. And in its early days, in effect, the estate was set up with around a medieval hall, which was restored, and then incorporating new buildings from many of the refugees from Bauhaus. So the Barn Cinema, for example, in Dartington Hall was designed by Gropius. Slightly surprisingly, not that it really shows, to be honest, but anyway, it was. But what the estate tried to do was establish a whole series of different crafts industries, and the students at the schools actually would spend a year in the early days in different crafts industries. So you would do pottery, or whatever. And so it went. I actually went to the school, which is perhaps one of the reasons that it's quite interesting to me. I went in the 60s when it completely lost its way, but it still did have a very strong crafts element, and you didn't have to go to lessons, so I did crafts. But I sadly can say that 350 pupils, probably about 3 on a voluntary basis chose to be active in anything, I suppose, like in the craft department. I think I was usually the only student. The other options were, as one might imagine, watching television, and smoking was very popular. So I'm going to talk about the Mechanics Institute. Oops, gone the wrong way. And again. The Mechanics Institute and a model for a village. I haven't talked about Morris at all because I'm really trying to look at things that are working with the existing conditions and not trying to completely reinvent from ground up. And the Mechanics Institute was a movement from the 1820s, which was set up by industry and was aiming to educate the workforce. And it was a very successful and popular movement. There were 700 mechanics institutes in the UK alone, and they spread over Europe and America as well. This is what you signed up for when you joined a mechanics institute, and you can see, sort of, you probably can't see, but there are illustrations of all the different activities from the arts and agriculture and science and engineering and so on. And this, to take it home to some extent, is the Coniston Mechanics Institute. So some of them were tiny, and this was built in the churchyard. When Ruskin came to live at Brantwood in 1872, he was immediately elected as the president of the Mechanics Institute, the Village Institute, and set about fundraising to build this building, which is the current Coniston Institute, as it's known. It is actually still a Mechanics Institute, one of only 12, in fact. Not that that's of any real interest, but most of the other mechanics institutes have become universities and art schools and museums and libraries. So it's an amazing history in itself, which I don't really have time to go into. But so this is the Mechanics Institute. Remember that image, because I'll be showing you what it looks like now. And at the back of the Mechanics Institute was a museum, which was a collection that Ruskin put together with Rawnsley and Collingwood, who was his secretary, in order to educate. And they're quite interesting, the Ruskin collections. There's a really very unknown, the one in Coniston. This is Rawnsley and Collingwood opening the museum. There's some interior shots. But the idea, this is the much more famous Ruskin collection in Sheffield, that's currently in the Millennium Gallery there. And Ruskin insisted that the artworks weren't artworks. So this very strong idea of a function for art, and that art for its own sake was something that he'd really turned away from. And something that I think, again, talking about crafts having this use value and actually doing something other than making, that the object is less important than what you learn in making it and what you understand from that process. So in a way, this museum, these museums that Ruskin created were kind of about the process, and they were about education. He wouldn't allow anyone to sign any of the artworks in the collection. So the picture of St. Mark's, which I think actually is a photograph, but one of his students, John Bunny, actually painted it, St. Mark's, over 7 years. Quite well known for it. He only worked between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning, with a certain light. And at one point, Ruskin's great enemy, Whistler, crept up behind Bunny and stuck a label on his back that said, "I am blind." So actually, in Ruskin's own life, you had this battle with the idea, with the aesthetic movement. Godwin wrote an essay, "Is Mr. Ruskin living too long?" It was quite celebrated. So the aesthetic movement and Ruskin's idea of use and value were quite at odds. And unfortunately, in my view anyway, the aesthetic movement kind of won out. It was funnier. I think that's why. Better quotes. Oscar Wilde was a great Ruskin disciple, but nevertheless. This was a project we did in the Millennium Galleries, a contemporary Grisdale project, where we served 7 kinds of soup, 7 courses of soup, and a whole programme which I won't go into. But soup was something that Ruskin was a great believer in, and experimented with developing the perfect soup, the soup of Hercules, well, the soup of Theseus it was actually, because everything has to have a classical reference. It was the soup that fortified Hercules before the labours. And so the idea was probably something like a minestrone, but a vegetarian soup that would sustain the working man. He was very concerned with sustaining the working man. And the soup is referenced quite a lot in Fors Clavigera, which is his letter to the working man, which was kind of a blog, a stream of consciousness. So some practical things that were happening in the Coniston Institute Ruskin was kind of quite old at this point, and so his disciples were really working for him, and they did all refer to him as the master or the professor. And Rawnsley and Collingwood were the principal amongst those, and they set up a woodworking guild in the village, and with Simpsons, who we saw earlier from Kendal, making the blanks and training people to carve patterns that were made by Collingwood. But it's quite a high standard, but they were real things that for real people, and their real value was the process of making them and the education process it went through. So it was mainly a mining community, and this craft was aimed to be something you did in addition to your job. So it really was handicrafts is the term that was used at the time, but this was a hobby, but quite a serious hobby, and aimed to make money. So the carving school continued until the Second World War. And quite a lot of people in the village imagine that every village has a carving school. That's just a standard. But this is a late piece that's in the collection of Lawson Park, which is the Grisdale headquarters. And that's a contemporary piece, which is you can probably recognise somewhere in there. There's a Rietveld chair and some bobbin work, so a sort of a little hybrid joke. Another of the industries was Ruskin Linen Industry, which again produced a lace that Ruskin had come across in Cyprus, which he encouraged in the Lake District. And again, this industry was really quite large scale. There were 150 lace makers working for it at its height. Interestingly, they had to invent the spinning wheel. Sorry, that's a pretty shocking quality photograph, but the spinning wheel, people had forgotten how to use it, and with Simpson, they remade them from bits and parts of them that they found. So this, in the 1880s, 30 years of no one really spinning, people have forgotten how they worked. So they actually had to reinvent it, which I find kind of extraordinary. And the other industry was metalwork, and repoussé specifically. And this started in the Institute, Coniston Institute, and continued in the Keswick School of Industrial Arts, which again was a general school for education, with the craft working as a sort of a way of making money to afford the rest of your education. This is the building now, and it says, you won't be able to read it, I might have to read it, "The loving eye and the patient hand shall work with joy and bless the land." It's now an Italian restaurant, and I put this slide in it's a hurried slide, just to illustrate the slight decline in standards of aesthetics. The bins, they're perhaps not ideally placed in front of the building, but obviously no one cares. So this is the interior in its heyday and with the shop. So it was, again, this carried on until 1982. So this was really quite a significant output. None of the output is really at the high end of the arts and crafts movement. It's all affordable, and it's all kind of nice quality, but nothing groundbreaking or earth-shattering. Although they did moved to stainless steel in the hand-beaten stainless steel in the 1930s, which was quite revolutionary and probably rather unwise, being very hard. Ruskin hated the thought. Some of the early experiments were done in brass, and Ruskin had an absolute fit at such a filthy metal should be considered against the noble, pure copper or tin or silver. And this is a very obscure project called the Migratory Dairy School, which was to teach farmers to make dairy products in the 1890s during the Depression. And it was a school under canvas that would pitch up in different villages and work for 10 days or so, teaching people to make butter and cheese. Again, kind of thing you think people would be knowing how to do that, but I mean, I think it was a lot about packaging it, and it was about the train network and making all of that work economically for farmers. So one of the projects that Grisdale has been involved in the last few years is the renewal of the Institute. So the Institute suffered a lottery grant, which meant that all of the content from the Institute was put into a museum, and a lot of it isn't that visible anymore. And it went from that incredibly cluttered, lively, extraordinary interior that I showed you earlier to basically an empty hall with a museum attached. So, I mean, it had to happen because so much of the content was extremely valuable, and an awful lot of Ruskin works in it, particularly paintings and so on. So the Institute really became relatively derelict, and we were invited by the village to help with the restoration of it. And they specifically had in mind that they would turn it into a conference facility and wedding centre, which seemed like an extraordinarily bad idea. Not so many people want to go to conferences in Coniston. It's quite a long way from anywhere. Anyway, so there was a quite gentle process that we went through, which took a long time and is quite key to the way that we currently work, where we try, as an arts organisation, we try not to push art. We try not to push our projects forward. We wait and try and encourage it, something that already exists, to develop. So it's kind of a slow and subtle process, but this slowly happened and is accelerated rapidly now. And the whole building, we also are not very keen on grants, so we don't try and get arts grants, so we don't come dragging our arts funding. We can completely transform all this with our arts thing. So this was done without funds, by volunteers, and initially that was all of us, and all of the artists working with us were press ganged into volunteer weekends. And slowly that built up until the volunteer group's about 40 now, and it's quite a good workforce. We can apply it to more or less anything. So the whole building's repainted and done up, and the signs were restored. A lot of it was restoration. We put in a shop, which was an artist project. This is called the Honest Shop, and it has a set of very arts and crafts type rules about product, and it's about things that people make for fun, hobbies, and it has food, and it has craft work and so on. This is a fairly early shot of it. It's kind of elegant looking because there's sort of an art involvement in it. But it actually returns, there was a shop in the Institute originally. And this shop is unstaffed and turns over around £25,000 a year. So it's a significant contributor to the whole running of the organisation. But more importantly, it has an action in the village where it's actually, that shop alone is kind of transforming how people understand the village and think about themselves. It's a kind of portrait of something else that other than gift shops and the rest of what's there. And the kitchen was restored, and that's me cooking for, I think it probably was the Garden Society meeting. So there's a lot of kind of communal eating. It was a new approach, and we eat a lot of vermin. So this is we have National Trust who are very keen on shooting vermin, and this was Canada goose. So it's sort of these things are otherwise thrown away. So complete waste. This is the reading room, which again is put back. How am I doing for time? Faster?
You're running over actually.
Oh, already. Whoops. Okay, I'll speed up. So the reading room and the library. So these projects all work where there's a demand. This is the county council library, and the books in it are selected by the county council, and it's quite well used, but it was about to disappear. So we got an artist called Liam Gillick to redesign it and make a new library. The fact that it's Liam Gillick doesn't mean anything to anyone in the village. In fact, they're massively critical of it all the time. There's lots of dust catchers in it. They're always pointing out. But actually, it's worked very well, and it's become very successful. And this is the main hall, which so we're reinvigorating the use of the hall, because that again died out, so we're putting on theatre performances. This is the school play, which we got Ray Davis from the Kinks to write for the local school. It's Ray. And perform in this, as a way of filling the hall. Ray, when he first visited, said, how do we get this place full? It was fairly effective. But that's most of the village actually in there. It wasn't actually a huge draw for people from outside of the area, strange. Well, it was, but it was already sold out. So, and this is Fernando Garcia Dori, a Spanish artist who set up a shepherd's school in Spain, and he was running the migratory cheese school. So actually a very direct sort of take on the Ruskin project. And this is the cheese at the cheese tasting. And this is the art fair and farmers market. So we have things like Listen and Modern Institute from the art sector, sat alongside turnips and farm produce, which actually kind of makes it's an interesting thing about value. Oops. And the youth club, who do a lot of the catering in the centre now, and the youth club whose motto is we make stuff, which they made up themselves. And here's some of the stuff they make. This is kimchi, Lake District kimchi. So, and here's some offal, or some vermin, which gets made into potted rabbit, rather than thrown away. So I'll rush through 5. Okay. This, just to give you a bit of background of what Grisdale Arts itself is, this is the Lawson Park farm. So this actually used to belong to Ruskin, the farm, and it's set above Brantwood, which is on the side of Coniston. And it's a very rough hill farm, appalling quality soil, very difficult location, overrun by deer, and wind actually is the worst thing, 600 feet above sea level. And we took it over about 5 years ago and started to try and, that's the Grisdale team in effect. The pig doesn't do anything. This is the buildings. So the buildings were renovated and are made workable. So we have residencies, the far end, live workspace, and this at the other end I live, and then in the centre is the kind of the public, semi-public space. And that's a view of the gardens from the gate. Very Ruskinian bit of planting there. Reeds, cheap as well. And there's the interior, dining room, kitchen. The whole building is set up as a collection. So here you see a range of things drawn from the things that I've been talking about. There's a Bernard Leach mug here, Keith Murray for Wedgwood, an architect designing for Wedgwood. Those are all hand-thrown, the mugs. So he was going for a machine finish, but through a hand-making process. And Edmund Elton, a local potter from the 1940s and 50s, and Linthorpe Christopher Dresser, which is a fascinating project, but I won't talk about it now. This is another interior shot. This is a local man who paints rather charming, naive animal pictures. And here's a Delftware wall that we did with him. And the gardens, which are open to the public, and a very good point of connection with people. The fact that we made gardens that that work in the location is something that people are very excited by. And gardens are a very good way to talk to almost anybody about conceptual notions, conceptual art actually. And the vegetable gardens, these are paddy fields that were built by they were laid out by Japanese farmers from a project we did in Japan. And this is the main productive area, so most of the food comes from these 8 paddy fields. And this is a building, very low-cost building project. So we're just involved in quite a lot of building at the moment to local housing, but houses that actually have a purpose, that actually it's a bakery, it's not a house, it's a business with a house attached. And this is a very cheap way to build using timber from the local timber mill. So I stop there because I think probably I can show you. I'll click through the pictures. This is the project we did at Frieze, which was the very antithesis of everything that we perhaps you would expect us to be involved in. But it's propaganda. We want to sell that message, the idea of art as a useful and as a real part of everybody's life. So here we have, this is produce from the shop. This is the youth club selling temperance drinks. The youth club have got quite a strong temperance ambition. The village is used as a stag night destination, so they've got reason to. And they were selling these kind of favela style drinks in plastic bags made out of sort of hedgerow odds and ends, and they made £1,000 actually in a day selling those at £1 a go. It was the thing to be seen with at Frieze, a bag. And this is a slightly more wacky art project. This is a gingerbread curator being dissected by Bedwyr Williams. And so the village made the cake. So the village were involved in lots of elements of this that are then translated with the artists in different ways, particularly for something like this, which is a piece of PR in effect. Chinese collective that we've worked with quite a bit called Yang Jiang, doing food calligraphy. And then that's the Japan project, I won't go into that. I'll just quickly mention this project I think it's still on at the Tate. It's with Law Provost. It's a kind of traditional project for us in a way because it's working with an artist to make some art for an art gallery, which we try to avoid on the whole, especially if it's something like that kind of very formalised art gallery. The idea of it came out of this story, which I've always loved, this is the ideal palace that was built by a postman on his days off. And that's him at the front with a stick, and that's his wife next to him. And for the duration of this build, they fought madly. He wanted to build the ideal palace, and she wanted to grow turnips. And that, to some extent, is the sort of dilemma, and that we all perhaps have to manage somehow. I'm the one that wants to grow turnips, by the way. But for Law, the project was about a battle between two people. One's making art, and the other's trying to turn the art into something useful. And the same battle happened between myself and Law. So she was trying to make art, and I was trying to make something useful. So this is us building a room for her to make a film in with the youth club. And this is the room itself with her installation in it. So all the crazy bits of art that have been transformed into useful things. And actually the end result, of course, is something completely useless and quite repellent. But there are a lot of pots in there as well. And that was one of the things we made was an addition of teapots. So a lot of this all happens on site. So within the organisation, there are the skills to actually make. So I made those. I make. I think it's very important that one isn't a director of an arts organisation. I am on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm making things all the time. There's very few days when I'm not actually making something. And there's Law using one of the cups. So let's go and see that. It's been nominated for the Turner Prize, which again is a bit upsetting, but that's the problem, really, in a way, that the problem for the arts and crafts movement is that it's translated immediately. It's the ambition of it, the real ambition of it, is then translated as a commodity, which is something we're all familiar with, but there's a good example of it. Okay, thank you.